All right, today we are diving deep into one of the most brutal conflicts in history, the 30 Years' War. I mean, this was a war that didn't just tear 17th century Europe apart, it completely redrew the map and left a scar so deep, its scale of devastation wasn't really seen again until, you guessed it, the World Wars.
And look, I want to be really clear about the stakes from the get-go. This quote, it's brutal, but it's necessary. Because this wasn't just some clash between armies on a distant battlefield. No, this was a total war. It was a war where ordinary people, civilians, suffered on a scale that's just unimaginable. We're talking about a complete and utter breakdown of society.
So that brings us to the big question, right? The one we're really going to try and unpack here. How on earth did a seemingly local religious dispute in one city explode into Europe's deadliest conflict before the World Wars? How does that happen? How does one little spark ignite a fire that just burns and burns for 30 years, pulling in pretty much every major power on the continent? Well, the answer, it's all about the world of the early 1600s, which was, to put it mildly, deeply, deeply fractured.
Okay, so to really get what happened, you have to picture Europe at this time as a giant powder keg, just waiting for a spark. We're about a century out from the Protestant Reformation, and the continent is just split right down the middle. You've got your Protestant rulers up north, your fiercely Catholic rulers down south, and the simmering pot of suspicion and tension pretty much everywhere in between.
And right at the heart of all this tension was a place called the Holy Roman Empire. You've probably heard Voltaire's famous jab at it, that it was neither holy, Roman, nor an empire. And you know what? He was spot on. It wasn't some unified powerhouse. Just try to imagine a patchwork quilt made of hundreds of tiny states, kingdoms, duchies, little principalities. Basically what we think of as Germany today. And all of them were just sort of loosely held together under one emperor.
So, you might be wondering, how did they even try to keep a lid on all this religious tension? Well, they had this principle. It was a Latin phrase, cuius regio eius religio. It basically means, whose realm, his religion. Think about that. If your local prince was a Lutheran, guess what? So were you. If he was Catholic, well, you were Catholic too. As you can imagine, this idea of forcing belief on people from the top down, it wasn't exactly a recipe for lasting peace. It was a super fragile solution that a lot of people hated, and it basically set the stage for a massive explosion.
Okay, so we've got our powder keg. Now, let's talk about the spark that lit the whole thing up. And honestly, it is one of the weirdest and most dramatic moments in all of history. It's called the defenestration of Prague. And yes, that is a real word. Defenestration literally means the act of throwing someone out of a window.
So here's how it all went down. Picture this. It's May 1618. A group of very angry Protestant nobles up in Bohemia are fed up with their hardline Catholic king, Ferdinand. So they march up to Prague Castle and corner two of his top officials. They hold this, trial right there on the spot, declare them guilty, and then they just toss them right out of a third-story window. And their poor secretary, too.
And here's where the story gets even crazier and really shows you how divided people were. The guys who were thrown out, they survived. A 70-foot fall, and they survived. So, how? Well, according to the Catholics, it was a miracle. Angels swooped down and saved them. The Protestant version of events was, let's say, a little less divine. Their story? The guys landed in a giant pile of horse manure. Seriously, angels or a dung heap? It didn't really matter. The line had been crossed. Bohemia was an open rebellion, and the war was on.
Now you'd think that this little revolt in Bohemia would have been crushed pretty quickly and that would be the end of it. But that's not what happened. Not at all. In fact, when the emperor did score a decisive victory, it just poured gasoline on the fire. It terrified all the other Protestant states and started pulling more and more countries into the fight.
So if you look at how things started, it was all going the Catholic emperor's way. I mean, they absolutely crushed the Bohemian rebellion at the Battle of White Mountain. Then the King of Denmark invades to try and help the Protestants, and they defeat him too. So the emperor, Ferdinand, is feeling pretty unstoppable at this point. And in 1629, he issues something called the Edict of Restitution. This was a massive overreach. He basically tried to turn back the clock and reclaim all the church lands that had become Protestant. And for a lot of people, that was just way too far.
And that overreach led to one of the most horrific events of the entire war, the sack of Magdeburg. The imperial army stormed this Protestant city, and what happened next was just pure butchery, a complete massacre. We're talking over 20,000 people slaughtered. This horror story became a massive rallying cry for the Protestant cause. It fueled this vicious cycle of revenge that made sure the war was only going to get even more brutal.
Okay, so the horror of Magdeburg, combined with the emperor's growing power, basically sent up a giant red flag across Europe, and it drew in two new major players who were about to completely change the game. This is the moment the conflict transforms from, a German religious civil war into a full-blown European showdown.
First up, coming in from the north, you have Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. They called him the Lion of the North. And this guy was the real deal, a deeply religious Lutheran, but also an absolute military genius. He looked at the emperor's power growing on the Baltic Sea and saw it as a direct threat to Sweden. So he lands his army in Germany, totally determined to turn the tide for the Protestant cause.
So why was he so effective? I mean, they don't call him the father of modern warfare for nothing. This is what's so fascinating. Up to this point, armies were these big, slow-moving blocks of soldiers. He completely changed that. He used smaller, faster, more flexible units. He upped the ratio of guns to pikes. And here's the kicker. He created light, mobile artillery that could actually move around the battlefield with his infantry. It was a total game changer. His army was fast, adaptable, and just dazzlingly lethal.
And then comes the ultimate plot twist. Get this. France, which is a major Catholic country, starts getting really nervous. They're looking at the map and seeing themselves surrounded by their rivals, the Habsburgs, who ruled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. So what does France's top guy, Cardinal Richelieu, a Catholic cardinal mind you, do? He does the unthinkable. He starts sending a ton of money to the Protestant Swedes to help them fight the Catholic Habsburgs. This is the moment it becomes clear. This war is no longer just about religion. It's about power.
So this new phase of the war was all about these larger-than-life figures, these absolute titans of the battlefield. But then, in this shocking 2-year period, they're all just gone. Count Tilly, the top Catholic general, dies from his wounds. Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish king, is killed leading a cavalry charge at the moment of his own victory. And then Wallenstein, the emperor's most brilliant general, gets a little too powerful for his own good and is assassinated. Just like that, the original giants of the war were all dead.
You'd think with all the main players gone, the war would just peter out. But it didn't. It just kept grinding on for another 14 horrible years. It was now mostly fueled by France and Sweden looking to gain territory. But finally, after 3 long decades, everyone was just exhausted, completely broken. So let's talk about what it actually cost to finally get peace.
The human cost is it's hard to even comprehend. We're talking somewhere between 5 and 8 million people dead. Just let that sink in for a second. And here's the really tragic part. Most of those people didn't die in battle. No, they died from the starvation and the disease that huge armies always bring with them, especially as they march back and forth across the land, just eating it bare.
I mean, look at these numbers. It was a demographic catastrophe. The German lands lost about 20% of their population overall. That's a bigger chunk of the population than they lost in World War I or World War II. But it gets worse. In the places that were hit the hardest, the loss was just staggering. Some regions lost up to 2/3 of all their people. Can you even imagine that?
So, after 5 long years of just talking, they finally hammered out a deal, the Peace of Westphalia, in 1648. This thing literally redrew the map of Europe. The Netherlands and Switzerland were officially recognized as independent countries, France and Sweden got chunks of new territory as spoils of war, and importantly, it created more religious tolerance within the empire. But its biggest impact, its true legacy, was something even more profound.
Because what the Peace of Westphalia really did was create the foundation for our modern world. It's often seen as the birth of the modern state system. It established this core idea that nations are sovereign, that what happens inside your borders is your business, and other countries don't have the right to interfere. Before this, you had this vague idea of a universal Christian empire. This was a radical change.
And so that leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on, right? This whole world order, the one built on the ashes of the 30 Years' War, was designed specifically to stop this kind of catastrophe from ever happening again. It's all based on that idea of national sovereignty. But now, almost 400 years later, you have to ask, is that order starting to fray? In a world with global problems that don't respect borders, is that old system, born from so much suffering, finally being tested to its absolute limit? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me.